I'm too shy, Lord. I don't have enough money. I don't look like them, and I'm not a good speaker like that person. Lord, I can't sing. I'm not smart enough. What do I really have to offer? Trust me, I'm preaching to myself right now. I struggle so much with feeling inadequate. Like I don't have the skills that I need to get the job done, at least not as good as someone else could. You know, it's these insecurities, these feelings of not being sufficient that hold us back from doing what God's called us to do. God doesn't expect perfection. He just wants us to be willing to try. You know, John Gowans writes about this in a poem. It's one of my favorites of his, and I'm sure many of you know it. You let some funny people work for you, and your disciples are a motley crew. The limited, the damaged, and the lame do daily wonders in your holy name. They're far from perfect. You don't seem to mind. They're far from worthy, and you're far too kind. You still prefer, and I note with glad surprise, to use the weak things to confound the wise. You know, God knows our abilities and lack thereof far better than we do, and He uses us anyway. He can take our weakness and make them strengths. What's He tell us right there in 2 Corinthians? My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. When we are weak, He is strong, right? If you don't mind, look back in the passage in Matthew for me again at verses 17 through 21. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, He said, and He directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then He gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Jesus took the 5 loaves of bread that was offered that night and blessed it. He fed multitudes until they were satisfied. With 12 baskets left over, we all know the story. How much more can He do if we offer up what we have, trust Him to bless it, to multiply it, and to make up for what we lack? How much more can He do? You know, I ask you again, do I really seem so naive to think that when relying on God's sufficiency, the mission we've been set forth to do is really a simple task? Speaking of the mission that we've been called to do, I want to look again at verses 15 and 16 there in Matthew. As evening approached, the disciples came to Him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." You know, the next thought I want you to get here is that whenever Jesus was asked to send everyone away, He doesn't respond with no, I'll feed them, or no, we will feed them. He says, no, you feed them. You. The disciples here wanted to send everyone away, but Jesus had other plans. Like I mentioned before, we see they didn't feel equipped. I urge you and myself, do not be like the disciples in this passage. Do not let your insecurities, your fear of failure, your doubts in your abilities allow you to push hungry souls away. You know, I'm guilty of this very thing myself. God puts that one person in your path that's desperate for some good news, just starving for the love of God. And what do? Oh gosh, that means I'm going to have to start a conversation with that person. Lord, that's out of my comfort zone. Oh, what if I'm going to have to talk to them about you? What if they want me to pray with them? Oh, worse, Lord, they're going to have questions and I don't have the answers. I'm not qualified, Lord. Someone else could do such a much better job than me, Lord. Please, they'll get fed somewhere else. Just send them away. Just send them away. You know what? God doesn't want to hear all of our excuses. His response to our excuses is they don't need to go away. You feed them. You. I know all of our lives are hectic. We get tired and we need rest, we need refreshment, we need to spend time alone with ourselves and with our Father. Christ was no different here. He needed those things as well. The difference here is that Christ didn't let those things prevent Him from meeting the needs of the people there. Look there in Matthew at verses 13 and 14. When Jesus heard what had happened, He withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed Him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, during this time, I can imagine Jesus was exhausted. He had been healing and teaching all over the place. He was facing the increasing opposition of his enemies. He just found out that John the Baptist had been beheaded. Jesus needed some rest. He needed to refresh. He needed to spend time with his disciples and with his Father. But what does he do? He sees that crowd there gathered waiting for him, and he stops and he heals them. You know, he doesn't send them away. Like the normal human inclination would have been to tell everyone, no more healings are going to happen tonight. Just dismiss the crowd. I'm not doing any more tonight. I need this time for myself. Jesus doesn't do that. He postpones his rest, his privacy, his time alone with his Father to meet the needs of those that were there that were helpless and suffering. You know, with the task that we've been given, you feed them. We're guaranteed to come across situations where it would be so much easier for us to just dismiss people, to put our own needs before theirs. But let me encourage you. Galatians 6:9, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I mentioned earlier that we as Christians are the only ones capable of meeting these spiritual needs around the world, feeding these spiritually hungry souls. And that's because we have something that 2/3 of the world doesn't have. That's Jesus, the bread of life. You know, without Jesus there that night with the disciples, those 5,000 men would have been left hungry and unsatisfied. In John chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry. Then further down, verse 49, your forefathers ate the manna, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. You know, if any of you are struggling tonight with those feelings of inadequacy, that you don't have anything to offer, let me ask you a question. Have you tasted the sweetness of my Jesus? If not, then you're probably right. You don't have anything to offer. And you know why? Because you yourself are starving. You know, Psalms 104, verse 14 through 15. He makes the grass grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread that sustains his heart. The love of Jesus isn't like those temporary fills, those things of the world that people search for that provide that instant gratification, but it's very brief and fades away. Things like alcohol and drugs and unhealthy relationships. No, Jesus is the bread of life, and his bread sustains our hearts. One taste of his sweetness, and we will never be hungry again. What a promise is that? What a promise. Now, many of us here, we have tasted that sweetness. We're filled and we're satisfied, and that's great. But we need to be out there feeding the souls of the world. You know, there are people out there that are suffering, people that are searching and starving for what we have. So I just want to leave you tonight with one question. Will you feed them?